saying that. Like I said, what's the capital of Louisiana? And one of my teammates said Baton Rouge, and I was like, yeah,
It is Baton Rouge.
But then one of my other teammates says, oh, I was gonna say Mardi Gras.
Mardi Gras? Oh, Mardi Gras, Louisiana. I was gonna say, now you're making me sad that I can't go to New Orleans for my conference this year. The food is so good, and there were brass bands every night, even though it was November and not at all Mardi Gras. All right, so a couple quick announcements for you. Your third quiz has posted this morning and will be due on Monday at 5 o'clock. Yes.
When I was looking at it earlier today, it did not show up.
Okay, I can fix that right now. Because I set it up yesterday, so I don't know why it's not. It's possible. So when we do this, what happened? Oh, gross. I don't like Microsoft Edge. Normally when they set up the classes, they set it up from the previous year. And so it's very possible that because I didn't build it from scratch, that there's something I overlooked. I am not perfect. Sometimes I make mistakes, but I try not to hold my mistakes against y'all. So let me go ahead and check that really quick and just make sure everything's all right.
In one of my classes, the date was funny. I don't know if it's this one.
It may not have been, because I tried to check the dates for drugs and behavior. Like I had to switch it so it wasn't an online test the other day, because last year it was. Like Casey was there. Casey remembers. All right, let me go to, where is it? Right there. Okay, let me take a look. Oh, I know why. Because it says the due date was the 13th and not the 20th.
Yeah.
That's what happened. I clicked the wrong thing. Yes, free open for any students that haven't taken the quiz, which is all y'all. So thank you for giving me a heads up about that. I try to be a little bit better on the ball, but sometimes with those little tiny details, it's really easy, especially when you've got 4 classes, to kind of get confused between them. So I'm always really grateful when you point it out to me. I appreciate that. All right. So I brought back Gritty and friends because I might try to throw things at you today. Very gently. That's why they're plush. And you can throw them at each other, but with kindness. Please don't take out any grudges that you might have on your classmates or anything like that. Don't do that. We have really nice laptops in here. We don't want to mess with those. Okay, so really quick. Last time we were here, we were talking about prosopagnosia and the fusiform gyrus and whether or not the fusiform gyrus is specifically for faces or specifically for our object of expertise. There we go, that's better. So what we find is that this idea that the fusiform gyrus is specifically for expertise, there is some evidence that it might be, but it's not a clean-cut division. And the reason for this is that we have actually looked at people who are experts in certain things, such as RM, who was a car expert, who could identify different types of cars and car parts, and then later suffered from prosopagnosia. And what we find is that even though his fusiform gyrus was damaged, he had poor face recognition, as anybody with prosopagnosia will, but compared to control patients that don't have this brain damage and are not car experts, he's still better than your average person at identifying vehicles.
When it came to identifying cars, was he worse than he was originally, or did that stay the same, or was there any like information?
That's a really good question. I can look it up because I haven't actually read this paper. It's talked about in other textbooks, but I can find this paper and find out for you. Because no, that's a really good question. Like, did he actually experience a detriment in his original knowledge? Because at least for me, If I'm an expert in something, I don't care if I'm better than the average person. I care that if I have damage to something, that I'm not worse than I used to be. And I think that's a really important distinction. So I will try to find what I can on this particular patient and see what I can dig up for you. Good question. Okay, so here is kind of my summing up of what we think about prosopagnosia and the fusiform gyrus. So expertise theory plays a role. This idea that the fusiform gyrus is specifically for expertise has a little bit of merit, but it's not fully and reliably supported. So we could potentially say, yes, there is something different about faces, and faces are special. But I bring this up, and I'm going to play devil's advocate for a little bit. So researchers like Herbert Simon and Anders Ericsson have always said that for expertise, it takes about either 10 years or 10,000 hours of exposure to develop expertise, whichever comes first. You might have heard this reported through Malcolm Gladwell in his book. Oh gosh, what is the name of that book? I only remember blank. Outliers, that's it, Outliers. And Malcolm Gladwell supported that, basically brought up the 10,000 hour rule. But it was originally developed by Simon and also purported by Ericsson. You have had exposure to faces your entire life. I can't speak for any of you. There's probably nothing more that I do in my life than look at faces, because I am constantly surrounded by people, and I have been my whole life. And there's nothing else that I've really been exposed to in my lifetime that really matches up with how often I'm exposed to faces, except for maybe reading. But reading is processed in a different area, not the fusiform gyrus. And so I want to potentially make the claim that perhaps if we got exposed to something, be it cars or birds, or musical instruments like different types of Fender guitars, if I had enough exposure to basically break that 10-year or 10,000 hour rule, maybe then we would potentially see something like what we see for faces in the fusiform gyrus. Because really, I don't think, when I think about my life, and possibly when you think about yours, there's probably very little that you do more at than look at each other's faces. Because we're people, we live in community. It also makes me kind of want to look at the fusiform gyrus of a hermit that hasn't seen people in many, many years. Because I'd want to see if the fusiform gyrus changed in response to that. Okay, so we're going to move on to a different topic. Did I put it in here? Yes, yes, I did. Okay. So we kind of have two options. I'm going to go ahead and start with perception and action. And we have another section on Monday. I may record visual attention for you. There are two major things I want to talk about, and I'll record that onto YouTube because it'll take like 15 minutes to cover, and that's it. But I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about perception and action. So one of the things that's really, really critical for visual processing is to help us figure out where objects are and what objects are so that we can interact with them properly. So we're going to talk a little bit about how perception enables us to act upon objects or have objects acted upon us. So if an object is coming at me, how am I going to use my visual perception to catch something that is being thrown at me, for example? So we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about imagery. So coming up with an image in your mind. And I want you to think about if imagery is like perception or if it's different. We're going to talk about our two visual streams, our dorsal stream and our ventral stream, and how they help us act. And then we'll talk about visual attention, including inattentional blindness and change blindness. So we're going to start by talking about visual imagery. So right now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to visualize in your mind an apple. So right now, think about an apple. Try to come up with the image of an apple in your mind. Now, here's my question. Does that apple look pretty realistic? Did anybody put like a blue apple? We're not talking about the blue candy apples that you get at the fair. That's not the same. But everybody got an apple that's pretty realistic? Cool. How did you not get that confused with an actual apple? Is your imagery so realistic that you could potentially mistake it for an actual apple? You don't, and we'll talk about why. So we do see that there are some similarities between what we can imagine and what we actually perceive. Now, I find for me in my experience that my visual imagery doesn't really look as good or as stable as what a real life apple looks like. Sometimes the apple changes shape a little bit. Sometimes the color modifies a little bit. So it doesn't look completely like actually perceiving an apple in that little basket of fruit at the dining hall. So we do find that there are some similarities between imagery and perception. But likewise, I can imagine that there is a block on the floor right in front of me. But check it out, I didn't trip over anything. I didn't actually think that that block was there. So we can imagine something, but imagining is very different from perceiving. The other question is, when we form an image in our mind, here's my question. Do you think that we are basically taking a memory of something that we've seen before and basically re-experiencing it? Or do you think we're coming up with a representation of what we think it should look like? So how many of you think it's kind of a reimagining something you've experienced before? Okay. How many of you think it's a mental representation? How many of you think, I don't know what it is, I just think imagery is cool? And that's okay too. But if it's only something that we have experienced, that means that I can't form an image of anything I've never seen before. So for example, I could never form the image of a dragon made out of ice cream scoops. Now, some of you may argue, but Dr. Gilchrist, you've seen images of dragons, you've seen images of ice cream scoops, you can combine those. And that's a fair point. But somebody who believes that it's a reimagining, you can never come up with something new. It always has to be something you've experienced before. And this is occasionally why when I talk about sleep and dreaming in general psychology, occasionally I do get comments like, you can never, if you see a face of somebody in your dream, it is probably a face that you have seen before. You are never going to see a new face in your dream. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's pretty interesting to think about. Yeah. Huh? That actually depends. There are some things that people who are blind can actually process. And we're going to talk about a couple of disorders where people who are blind are still experiencing imagery, but they're thinking that that's what they're actually seeing. They're mistaking their imagery for perception. So here's the thing. We don't confuse images with actual objects. It's almost as if when we are imagining something, we say to ourselves, yeah, this came from my mind. So if I imagine an apple on this desk and I form the image of it, I'm not going to be like, oh, that apple looks so delicious. What? It's not there? Like, I recognize I made that myself, and because of that, I don't mistake it for real perception. Little plush Captain America, well, I didn't make him up. He's right here in front of me. But if I imagine something next to him, I'm almost like, no, my mind came up with that. So it's almost like we tag it with, this is something I made up. Yeah.
How does that work
worse when like the person's hallucinating, so they're imagining something's there, but it's not actually there.
Well,
I think it is.
Well, if we're talking about the kind of hallucinations that happen under the influence of drugs, that will usually happen because of inhibition of the frontal lobe. So for those of you that are in drugs and behavior or have had drugs and behavior, when we talk about psychedelics, many of them work the way they do by inhibition of the frontal lobe. So that way you can really no longer tag it with, I made that. The other thing that we know, and if you've had biopsych with me, you might remember me talking about schizophrenia. And so people who have schizophrenia often hallucinate. Now, whereas with psychedelics, a lot of those hallucinations are going to be visual in nature. For people with schizophrenia, it's often auditory in nature. So they'll hear voices like voices that are telling them they're stupid or that people are trying to control them. And one of the things that we know about people with schizophrenia is they have some underactivity and atrophy in their frontal lobes. The frontal lobe is really critical for a lot of planning and organizing and attention. And it's also where your personal sense of self comes from. So one interesting theory that's been brought up with people that have schizophrenia, do you talk to yourself? Like, how many of you actually talk to yourself and think thoughts to yourself? Not everybody does, but a lot of people do. For people that have schizophrenia, it's been suggested that those auditory hallucinations are their own thoughts. But because they have that frontal atrophy, they can't tag it the way that you or I can. When I think to myself, I need to go home and get my headphones, or my hair's not looking so great today, I need to fix it. I know that those are coming from me because I tagged them. I know I made them. Somebody with schizophrenia doesn't have that ability, so they believe that their own thoughts are potentially coming from somewhere else. Now, that might vary from person to person, and it's just a theory for how those hallucinations happen, but I think it's a pretty interesting one. But with psychedelics, it's specifically because you are basically inhibiting a lot of your like higher functioning cortical areas. You're basically uninhibiting yourself or inhibiting parts of yourself and loosening up other parts. Okay. So to get back to the question of whether or not this happens with blind people, it absolutely can. We have a phenomenon that is known as Anton syndrome or Anton syndrome. So there are people who were previously sighted. So that's what's kind of critical. These people had to have been sighted. They had to have been able to have sight at some point. And they actually mistake imagery that they came up with perception. Something kind of related to this is Charles Bonnet syndrome. Charles Bonnet syndrome is not for people who are blind, but people that have diseases of the eyes. And they actually form hallucinations that are mistaken for perception. So this does give some credence to the idea that imagery and perception may not actually be all that different from each other. Got my brand new phone a couple of weeks ago and they're already trying to sell me on the iPhone 13. I haven't even had my phone for a month yet. Like, I like having shiny new toys, but not this soon. I can wait a year or two, it's fine. Well, I'm sorry you didn't have a softball game. I'm sorry that it was a lake.
Okay, we play this weekend.
Yay. I'm sure Smedley will walk by and wish you well at some point. My partner doesn't have to work overtime this weekend, so he will be taking Smedley for a lot of walks. So you might see him if there aren't too many off-leash dogs running around. We've found so many this week. They're all very nice dogs, but my dog is nervous and just wants to be left alone. He's an introvert, but just with dogs, he loves people. Okay, everybody good? Okay, so imagery is useful. Imagery allows us to make predictions about what could happen, and it also helps us answer what if questions. So for example, if I asked, what if we were having our next class on the moon? Now, we're obviously not going to do that, but you could come up with a visual image of that, couldn't you? Yeah, probably. I bet I look rockin' in a spacesuit. That is what I know. And we'll all be bouncing up and down. But imagery can be helpful for us. It can help us think things through. And so if we're going to talk about imagery, we have to talk about the work of Plichlin. Plichlin has developed a theory for about the past 20 or 30 years that basically says that visual images are designed to resemble our perception. And the reason that imagery resembles perception is because of the work of what he termed the visual buffer. The visual buffer, so when we talk about a buffer, so just a reminder, remember that in the history of cognitive psychology, a lot of cognitive psychology got its terminology and its structure and its theory from computer science. So if anybody's ever messed around with computers, the word buffer is a term in computer science. It's designed for short-term storage of information. So if we extend this terminology to cognition, a visual buffer is like a tiny little storage component for short-term visual information. And Plichlin believed that this short-term storage is not only used for perception, but it's also used in imagery. So the visual buffer is involved in both of these processes, which means that they are going to resemble each other. Plichlin also argued that perception is a bottom-up process, looking very much like the object recognition processes that we've talked about for about the past week. So we start with separating an object from its background, looking for the edges, parsing object features like color and depth and texture, and then integrating that all together to form a whole object. So perception, Plichlin argued, is a bottom-up process. Imagery, on the other hand, requires prior knowledge and experience, and so it is going to be a top-down process. I drank too much of the flavored coffee today. I was like, I'm going to try the chai latte. And then I'm like, I need more. I'm going to get like a little half cup of the toffee. I don't think I should have done that. Now I'm going to be too wired. Everybody good? Okay. So now we have to talk about the work of somebody who basically had a rebuttal against Plichlin. And folks, I'm going to pronounce this name as good as I can. It's Plichlin. It doesn't look like Plichlin. It's Plichlin. Actually, if you want this researcher's full name, his name is Zenon Plichlin. That is a cool name. But Plichlin basically was rebutted to Plichlin that imagery does not look like perception at all. He actually proposed what he termed a propositional theory, for example, in a paper in 2002. So imagery does not require you to form a picture. Rather, it needs knowledge. You need to know what things would look like. So here's what's interesting. And one of the ways that we can test whose theory is correct or not is by considering whether or not areas like the primary visual cortex would be involved. Now, Koslin's theory of the visual buffer basically says that the visual buffer is the primary visual cortex, which is also called V1. So that's where the visual buffer is in Koslin's system. So the area that starts processing vision, primary visual cortex, is the area that is the visual buffer. For somebody like Plichlin, because this is not pictorial knowledge, because it's not visual knowledge, it's propositional verbal knowledge, the visual cortex is not involved. So there's a really easy way to test this theory. We can look at people while they are forming images and see if the primary visual cortex is involved while forming images. Pretty straightforward. And if there's anything you don't quite get or don't understand in this lecture, do remember that it is going to be recorded, so you can go back and listen to this whenever you want. I have a YouTube channel, and somehow or other, against all odds, it is growing. I now have a whopping 305 subscribers. Most of them are probably bots. By the way, while y'all are waiting, I went to the movies last night and we had to leave after the first hour of the movie because the sound cut out. We couldn't understand what anybody was saying. Like it would cut in and out. So it would be like 3 seconds of auditory information. And then all of a sudden you spent like the next 20 seconds trying to read lips. And there was like nobody in the theater except 5 people, which is exactly how I like my movie experience. Like it's a far cry from when I saw Avengers Endgame and it was basically shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. But unfortunately, there are like 2 teenagers working the entire theater. And I felt so bad because like all the people in the theater are starting to complain and I'm like, they don't know what to do. Like they didn't think this was going to happen tonight. So everybody's angrily asking for a refund. And I'm like, they're like, do you want a refund? I'm like, no, I think you need this money more than I do. So we're going to try to go back tonight and hopefully it won't happen again, but if it does, at least it streams in October. But I will say of the first hour, I liked what I saw of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. It was very fun. Like I like martial arts movies. I like old school Jackie Chan movies. So it was kind of right up my alley. Okay, so what you are looking at here is a way that we can actually figure out if imagery looks like perception or not. Now, because I'm recording this, I can't walk over and explain this to you. So you're going to have to follow my cursor. So the idea, if imagery is like perception, they should be able to influence each other. So for example, if I imagine an apple, I should have an easier time recognizing one in a picture search later on, specifically because I imagined it, and imagery and perception make use of similar processes. So the idea is performance will be better, whether that's identification or things like that, when our perception and the image that we form are the same. And we do actually have evidence for this facilitation. So what you are looking at here is what is referred to as binocular rivalry. So right now I want you to close one eye and see with your other eye, and then do the same thing on the opposite eye. So one of the things that makes our visual images and our perception easy to deal with is that for the most part, each of our eyes are getting the exact same image. But what would happen if I showed this image to your left eye, a face in green, and this image to your right eye? What we're going to find is that your eyes are going to try to fuse those images and you'll get something like this. But here's the catch though. You can't, those are separate images, so you can't really fuse them, can you? So your perception is going to have the experience of shifting back and forth between seeing a green face and then a red house and then back to a green face. So this is what's called binocular rivalry. We basically force the images in each eye. We make them different so that they can compete with each other. And our perception is that the image will shift back and forth between the two images. Does anybody have any questions on how this works? Yeah.
Is this kind of like when they use like the 3D glasses in movies? Is it similar to that?
Well, no, because in that case, it's kind of like that, but the difference is with the 3D glasses, you are actually getting the same image to each eye. So there's not really a lot of competition there. The 3D images are kind of exaggerate the blur, the difference between your two eyes, but they're not actually competing with each other. Let me see if we can actually, I use this in sensation and perception, but I want to see if I can find it here. We can actually see some binocular rivalry. Oh my gosh, how did it get so big? Oh my gosh, that's so much better. It was freaking me out. Okay, let me see if I can find one. So let me see. There's one that you can actually do yourself. So let me see if we can go here. So what you should be able to do, if you can, there's probably going to be a lot of pop-ups here, but let me kind of zoom in. What I'd like you to try to do, I'm going to move my head a little bit. I want you to try to fuse those two images together so that you have a third square in the middle of the two images. So you might have to cross your eyes a little bit for that to happen, but that third square that you can fuse is going to shift back and forth between up and down stripes and horizontal stripes. That's binocular rivalry in action. Your perception is constantly shifting between those two different images that the eye is getting. Normally, the images that our eyes are getting are not that different from each other. We here in this kind of study, we're just going to exaggerate that a little bit. So we'll have people, we can actually see when they're perceiving these different images by having them press one button when they see the face and another button when they see the house. So they're constantly going back and forth between pressing these different buttons because the perception is constantly shifting. So I want to talk about a study by Pearson in 2008. So participants were either told to watch a grating that looked like this, or they were told to imagine a grating. So again, this is binocular rivalry. So notice, for example, that the left eye is presented in green and it's going in this direction. The one in right is presented in this direction, in the opposite direction, and it's red. So your perception is going to constantly shift between the two. Now, here's what's kind of critical about Pearsons study. They were shown a particular grading ahead of time before this task, or they were told to imagine a grading. So let's say, for example, that one group got this grading to look at ahead of time before the binocular rivalry task. Another group was told to imagine a red grading with a diagonal line that looked like this. Now, here's what's interesting. So they either had to see or imagine one of these gradings before doing the task. We find out that regardless of whether they had to see it or imagine it, the stimulus that they initially had to process whether they saw it or imagined it, was perceived more often in the binocular rivalry task. So if you saw this grading at the beginning, you were going to perceive this stimulus more than this one. If you imagined it, the same thing happened. So this study shows that perception and imagery do in fact make use of similar processes. And by the way, they did this with neuroimaging. So while they were in an fMRI scanner, they were pressing buttons every time they perceived something. All right, everybody good? Okay. So I want you to imagine something right now. So you can draw this on your paper if you want, but we're going to try this. I already know the answer. It's also in your book. Don't cheat. I want you to imagine a cube that is balanced on one corner. So by corner, so I mean like this corner. So like balance it on a corner and then cut it across the equator, that middle point while it's balanced on its corner. What is the shape? So I'm going to cut at the equator. When I take those two halves, what is that cut surface going to look like when I remove that top half? So it's like if I cut a potato in half, the cut surface the top of the cut surface resembles a circle. Kind of, potatoes are circular-ish, but what would this look like? Does anybody know? Okay, so we've got a square or a rectangle? A trapezoid. Okay, anybody else? You're imagining it right now. Okay, so who says rectangle? Who says square? Who says trapezoid? Who has no idea and wants me to give them the answer? Okay, did anybody think about a hexagon? Because that's the correct answer. So kind of imagine here, this is our square. And of course, people are like, that's not fair. That's vaguely described. Fair enough. I can grant them that. But if we balance a square on the equator or on a corner, and then we cut it in half like this, that cut surface is a hexagon, which actually makes sense when you think about it. How many sides does a cube have? 6. And a hexagon has 6 sides. So this kind of shows us that our imagery is not as good as we think it is. It's pretty good, but it's not perfect. If you were looking at this as you're perceiving this now, it's pretty easy to get when you're perceiving it. It's a little harder to imagine it. Okay, so I will also bring this up. Imagery also does not really help us out when we're thinking about map directions. And Casey, I'm specifically bringing this up to you because you're from Nevada. You can't answer this question. Okay, what's farther west? Las Vegas or Los Angeles? Who says Las Vegas? Who says Los Angeles? You are all wrong. So if you want to come up to the map and check it, if you don't believe me, I think it's on the map. It isn't. They put Reno, but they didn't put, they put Reno. They put Reno, but they didn't put Las Vegas. That makes no sense to me. Okay. I will pull it up for a second. I will pull it up because it's easier. Okay. US map, and I don't care if it's Microsoft Edge at this point. Yeah, I know. All right. I want map with cities. Map. I can't spell either. That's Minneapolis, St. Paul. Okay, they're like, this is the map. What are you talking about? Okay, so here's Las Vegas. Oh, actually, I kind of messed that up. I messed that up quite a bit. I forget what it is for the map one. I think it's Reno that's the case. It's Reno or Los Angeles, not Las Vegas. If you said if Los Angeles is farther west, you were right, and Dr. Gilchrist is very sorry. And we'll make that up to you with some extra credit next week. You don't always get extra credit when I make mistakes, but yeah, I think it's Reno rather than Los Angeles. And here's why people get that wrong. People get that wrong because they assume that California as a whole must be west of anything that is in Nevada, and that is not necessarily the case. Now, it is the case for Las Vegas. Dr. Gilchrist screwed up the example city, but it is actually Reno. Okay. But our imagery is not always as good as we expect. Imagery isn't always like perception. Imagery is oversimplified descriptions. If it were just like perception, you should have had no trouble answering that a hexagon was the answer. Okay, so really quick, what I'd like you to do for each of these shapes, you are better at imagery than you think you are, but manipulating and rotating images can also be difficult. What I'd like you to do, without moving your head around, is I'd like you to rotate this in your mind. And so this bird, I'd like you to rotate it by about 90 degrees. And I'd like you to tell me what you see. Okay, it's a cat, right? Here we have a duck. We're gonna rotate that 90 degrees. What do we get? A bunny. We get this bird. We rotate it 90 degrees. What do we get? Squirrel. Is everybody kind of seeing those now that we've rotated them? So there they are. So your imagery is actually better than you think you are. And this does bring us into mental rotation. So what kind of processes are involved when we rotate images? So this is a very simple example from Shepard and Metzler back in 1971. So here's the thing. When I physically rotate an object, the more time that it takes to rotate the object, the more that I need to move the object, the more time rotation takes. So if I turn this 90 degrees, that doesn't take very long. But if I turn it 180 degrees, it takes longer. Shepard and Metzler have actually argued that mental rotation works much like physical rotation. The more that you have to rotate an object in your mind, the more time it takes. So here's what they had people do. They had people look at these Tetris figures and figure out if they are mirror images of or if these are the same object or if they're different from each other. So rotate one of these objects. Are these objects the same or are they different? They are the same. What about this one? So these are pretty easy. They both are the same. This one involves a 90-degree horizontal turn. This one involves kind of a negative 90-degree kind of upward turn. Now, if I had to rotate those 180 degrees or 270 degrees, it'd take me more time to figure out the answer, much like physical rotation. And so Shepard and Metzler did actually find that mental rotation operates similarly to physical rotation. They had these kind of figures vary by either 90 degrees, 180 degrees, or 270 degrees. The more far apart they were and the more rotation that was required, the longer it took people to make a response. So the assumption here is with physical rotation, the more that two items are rotated, the longer it takes to decide whether objects are the same. And it turns out that a mental rotation is similar. The more that items are rotated, the longer it takes to make a decision. So here you're looking at clockwise and counterclockwise measurements. Notice that the quickest time to respond here is when there's no rotation at all. But as you move farther away from 0, from 45 to 90, and it is more complicated if it's clockwise, but let's go ahead and look at counterclockwise instead. The farther away that you get from 0 and the closer that you get to 180 degrees, the longer it takes, just like physical rotation. So we're going to talk about one more tiny thing, and I'm going to leave it for Monday, the rest of it. This is one of the few times that I get to talk about gender differences, because generally we don't find a lot of gender differences in cognitive psychology, except when it comes to mental rotation. And one of the things that we find across the board is that generally males tend to perform better than females. But let's talk a little bit about why. So are men better at mental rotation? So sometimes you'll hear about this. Men are better at mental rotation. Women are better at finding objects because men were the hunters and women were the gatherers, and they had to remember where all the good crops were. Dr. Gilchrist hates that, like, evolutionary psychology ad hoc explanation. So there are very few robust gender differences in cognitive psychology except for mental rotation. Now, it is entirely possible that there is a true difference there, but I also want you to consider what else could make these differences possible, besides the evolutionary perspective that Dr. Gilchrist does not like. What are some other things? Well, this is not really true. This is the first thing that always comes to my mind. And this is not so much true today. How many of you are very, very active with video games? How many of you play first-person shooter games? Dr. Gilchrist used to play Nintendo with like the 2 buttons and the D-pad. So I don't really do first-person shooters. When I saw my first Xbox controller, I was like, what are all these thumbsticks and these extra buttons? Even now when I play a game that I'm good at, like LA Noire, if there's shooting involved, I hand the controller over to my partner because he's got more experience with those games than I do, despite the fact that I'm really good at Tetris, which I am. It's the only game I can beat. And yes, I played the B type because B is the only one you can beat. So it's not true as much now, but when I was growing up, boys had more games that were designed to consider their spatial orientation. You know, up until they really started marketing Legos to girls, they were often treated as a boy's toy. And so it's possible that boys just get more exposure to things that they have to mentally rotate growing up. So I will stop here, but I love this comic, so I'm going to leave off on here. We will talk about this next time, because some stereotype threat could potentially play a role here. When you know that girls tend to do worse on certain tasks, that does bring a little bit of worry, anxiety, and self-fulfilling prophecy into it, which we will talk about next time. Have a wonderful weekend and take care of yourselves, and I will see you on Monday.